My brothers-in-law and I occasionally gather for an evening of poker. It's not a regular event, and we only manage it a few times a year. Recently, our wives went on a shopping trip together, giving us the perfect opportunity to play a few hands. My wife, Janet, has a sister and a brother. That particular evening, her brother, Christian Nelson, invited David Phillips to join our game at Chris's house. Chris sat to my left, and David was across from me. Both David and Chris are lawyers at Nelson, Preston, and Peterson, the most successful law firm in the area. Janet's father, Jacob, was one of the original partners. Years ago, he bought out the other partners, so the firm is now entirely controlled by the Nelson family. Janet and her sister, Peggy, known as Peg to the family, are both lawyers. Peg married Edward Powell, a civil engineer who sat to my right. He's a decent guy, especially for an engineer, and we get along well. Janet was stuck with me, Jerry Parker. I wasn't Irish, and I wasn't a lawyer. Two facts that caused quite a bit of family drama. If it weren't for her mother, Sally, taking an inexplicable liking to me, I never would have survived the constant criticism from old Jacob and his son, Chris. I was a mason, working with brick, mortar, blocks, and concrete. My father had been one before me, and I never wanted to do anything else. He insisted I go to school to learn the trade, but I resisted at first. My dad could lay block across the entire state and back, staying within a quarter-inch of square and level. I figured I just needed to learn from him. What more was there? It turned out there was a lot more to learn. After 2 years of school, I joined Dad in his business. My education allowed us to improve our materials and mixtures. I seized every opportunity to modernize and mechanize our operations. I introduced Dad to new, faster methods for building with brick and block, while he taught me the difference between slapping up masonry and true craftsmanship. Together, we learned how to maintain the quality of our work while completing it more efficiently. The business expanded, and we hired 3 men to keep up with the increasing workload. At 27, I was a partner in a thriving enterprise when I met Janet. We faced an issue with a supplier who took our deposit but didn't deliver the materials. I went to the Nelson law firm to explore our options. Janet, who was 26 and the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, was assigned our case. She handled it skillfully, and we recovered our money without going to court. By then, I was completely infatuated with her. Every time a payment was late or an order delayed, I tried to convince my father that we needed legal assistance again. Jerry, for crying out loud. He finally exclaimed one afternoon, while we were laying blocks for a huge house in the Poconos, "Why don't you just ask her out on a date? It would save me a ton of money and help me maintain good relations with our customers and suppliers. We can't sue every Tom, Dick, and Harry we do business with just so you can see that red-headed girl." I was taken aback. Did he really think I just wanted to see Janet again? How could he know what I was thinking? Was it that obvious? "You must think I'm blind," my father laughed. "It's pretty clear that girl has you all wrapped up. I was the same way with your mother, but I didn't need a flimsy excuse. I kept after her until she finally gave up and married me." "She's a lawyer, Dad," I protested. "I'm just a mason. She won't be interested in a guy like me." "She definitely won't be interested in a whiner," my father shot back. "You don't understand what women really want. I may not be an expert, but I know one thing. You are an excellent mason, possibly the best I've ever seen. You never need to apologize to anyone, man or woman, for making an honest living with your hands. She probably deals with enough smooth-talking backstabbers and might be tired of them. Be confident. Ask her out, and don't act like you're inferior. If she says no, try again in a week. It took me 2 months to get your mom to agree to go out with me. I spent the rest of the week reflecting on what my father had told me. It's funny how perspective changes over time. At 17, I thought he didn't know anything, and being around him made me feel dumber. Now, 10 years later, he seemed to have become incredibly wise. That Friday, I waited in the parking lot for Janet to leave her office. I was still in my work clothes, sweaty and covered in dust. I had resolved to ask her out and knew if I went home to clean up, I'd lose my nerve. "Hello, Janet," I started. "I don't know if you remember me, but I'm Jerry Parker," Janet interrupted with a laugh. "Of course I remember you, Jerry. Are you having another issue with your suppliers?" "Actually, I'm having trouble thinking about anything but you, Janet," I admitted. "Would you like to go out to dinner or see a movie with me?" "I hope you'll at least take a shower first." I hadn't noticed her brother, Chris, approaching from behind. He had heard the entire conversation I thought was private. "So, sis, are you really going out with this hard-working guy? Maybe he'll treat you to McDonald's and a documentary about the Hoover Dam. And if he so much as touches you, we'll know. Dusty fingerprints all over you," he remarked snidely. From his looks and comments, I quickly deduced he was Janet's brother. Resorting to physical confrontation would have been a mistake, so I decided to salvage some pride by walking away. Just then, I recalled my father's advice. "Janet, will you go out with me?" I repeated. Janet glanced from me to her smirking brother. She took my hand and pulled me aside. "Walk with me for a bit, Jerry. We don't need this jackal eavesdropping on our conversation, do we?" she said rhetorically. We walked across the lot to a small park. She sat on a bench and gestured for me to join her. "Jerry, you've just met my brother, Chris. I love him, but he's snobbish and self-centered. My dad is pretty much the same. Whenever guys, now men, come to our house to take me out, the two of them act like jackals. If I agree to go out with you, expect them to ridicule and insult you. No one who takes me or my sister Peggy out is ever good enough." Janet sighed. "Ask yourself if being with me is worth the misery and torment you'll face from my family. I'm telling you this because I'd love to go out with you, but I don't want you to suffer because of them. If you've changed your mind after meeting Chris and hearing about my family, I'll understand," she concluded. "Would 7 o'clock be okay?" I asked. That marked the beginning of a challenging courtship. Her brother and father were the most unpleasant pair I'd ever met. They did everything they could to discourage me, but I kept coming back because I was deeply in love with Janet. We married just over a year and a half later. It took some time, but even old Jacob and Chris eventually accepted me. Having our 2 children, Sharon and Earl, certainly didn't hurt my standing in the family. It's funny how even the most difficult son-in-law can produce the best grandchildren. Janet's mom, Sally, had been my strongest supporter from the start. I never knew why, but I was grateful for her kindness. After 17 years of marriage to her daughter, Sally treats me like a son. Janet's cousin usually made the 4th in our card games, but he couldn't make it this time. Chris had invited David, which was problematic. David had a bad case of verbal diarrhea and an exaggerated sense of his charm with women. He was Chris's best friend and had even dated Janet a few times before she went to law school. Suffice it to say, he was a pain in my ass. During the 6 months I spent in Montrose, I slept with at least 10 different women, David boasted. 7 of them were married. There's just something exhilarating about getting involved with another man's wife. "David, that sounds incredibly risky," Eddie cautioned. "You could end up getting shot or tangled in lawsuits. Professionally, it could ruin your reputation." "No risk, no reward," David laughed. "That bad boy image actually boosts business. Men are intimidated, women are intrigued. They see me as macho and seek my counsel." "You might target the wrong woman, David," Eddie warned. "She could report you to her husband, and you'd be kicked out in a heartbeat for bothering a married woman." "Jacob won't be in charge much longer," David said nonchalantly. "Chris will take over soon, and he won't pay any attention to baseless allegations from jealous husbands, right, Chris?" "I'd do my best for you, David, but it's wise not to put yourself in that position. My sisters will also have a significant say in firm decisions," Chris reasoned. "Then I suppose I'll have to charm them into agreement," David grinned. I threw my cards on the table and stood up. "I'm done with this game, and this arrogant jerk," I declared. "Hey, it's not my fault you can't satisfy your wife," David retorted. "I'm just fulfilling a need for neglected wives. And I bet Janet is one of them." "You miserable, worthless prick," I hissed. "If you so much as look at Janet the wrong way, I'll rip your heart out and shove it up your ass." Chris and Eddie both stood, trying to calm me down. "That's just David's sense of humor," Chris soothed. "Don't take it personally, Jerry. He didn't mean anything by it." "The hell I didn't," snarled David. "You can't expect a bricklayer to understand or satisfy women. They prefer men with power and savoir-faire, if you even know what that means." "You pompous weasel," I spat. "I said my piece. Stay away from Janet." "I'm not shaking, Cement Boy. I've decided to accept your challenge. In a few weeks, I'll be in bed with your wife," David predicted. "By the time I'm done, she'll have forgotten all about you." I started around the table, but Chris and Eddie quickly intervened. "He's just trying to provoke you," Eddie reasoned. "Janet wouldn't give him the time of day, and you know it. Don't let his mouth and your temper land you in a world of trouble." "Well, screw you too, Eddie," shouted David. "Just for that alone, I'm going to sleep with Peg too. I'm going to show those two how a real man knows how to pleasure a woman." David was practically foaming at the mouth as he spoke, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. I gripped Eddie's shoulder, holding him back. I wasn't sure he could handle David, and frankly, if things escalated, I wanted the satisfaction of dealing with that bastard myself. "The game is over," Chris announced. "I'm asking both of you, Eddie and Jerry, to please leave. We all need to cool down." Chris was right. We needed to take a step back. It was his house, after all. When a man asks me to leave his place, I respect that. And when I ask someone to leave mine, they'd better be out the door before I finish my sentence. A man's house is his castle. Eddie and I made our way to the door, Eddie still muttering under his breath. I wasn't any happier. David was a miserable prick. I decided not to tell Janet about the whole affair until things settled down, and I could figure out my next move. One thing was for sure, David would regret any trouble he caused my family. By Monday evening, Janet met me at the door with a cold beer and a barrage of questions. "I heard you left the card game early Saturday night, Jerry. Why was that?" she probed. I'm a terrible liar, and I had thought this over. I decided to just tell Janet the truth. She's smart and can handle herself. Chris asked both Eddie and me to leave. I said plainly, "There's more to it than that, isn't there, Jerry?" Janet pressed. "You threatened David. You told him to stay away from me, didn't you?" "I consider it a warning, not a threat, Janet. No man is going to talk about sleeping with my wife while I'm still breathing," I replied calmly. "I'm sure David didn't use those exact words," Janet remarked. "He told me all about how hostile you were to him. He thinks you're still jealous because I dated him long before I met you." And Chris pretty much agrees with David's version. "You lost your temper and overreacted to an innocent comment, didn't you?" For some reason, Chris has his head so far up David's ass, he can't get enough oxygen to feed his brain. They both seem to think your father's about done with the firm, and that Chris will be the next Nelson to rule the business, with David right by his side, entertaining Chris's sisters and anyone else he can. That's pretty much the gist of their conversation. I responded, "Jerry, I know that can't be accurate. Peg and I will have a say in any decisions regarding the company, and Chris knows it." "David must know that as well," Janet reasoned. "That's why he's trying to manipulate you and Peg into seeing things his way. He seems to believe that once he gets involved with the Nelson girls, they'll honor his requests just for another chance to be with him. It looks like your fate is sealed, at least in David's mind. Jerry, Chris is my brother. He would never condone those words or actions from David," Janet replied indignantly. "You're blowing everything out of proportion. I never knew you to be this jealous." I reached down, placed my hands under Janet's arms, and lifted her so her face was very close to mine. "Janet, I love you more than you'll ever realize. That said, I will never tolerate any infidelity, nor will I stand by and allow that asshole to attempt to ruin my family. Make no mistake about that. I understand why you might think Chris and David would have more couth than to say what I told you. I'll cut you some slack because Chris is your brother and you love him. Just don't fall for David's bullshit, I'd warned. You're such a big, strong man, holding a little girl like me up like this. Do you think I'm afraid of you, Jerry Parker? Janet laughed suddenly. I know you love me completely and will never hurt me. The kids are at Mom's tonight, so I suggest you either put me down or show me why I don't need another man, if you're up to it. That's the way it was with Janet. She would drive me crazy and annoy me with all kinds of asinine stuff, and then suddenly demand I make love to her. I think it was her way of ensuring I would listen to her and keep me mollified. It always worked. I carried her into the bedroom and made her realize I was all the man she could ever need. At least, that's what I believed. She reinforced my conviction that I couldn't love her any more than I already did. I knew that for sure. Over time, I realized that Janet rarely mentioned David, and that bothered me. She worked with him every day, so why wouldn't she talk about him? My bond with my brother-in-law, Eddie, strengthened following the heated card game incident. He was livid that David would insinuate that Peg might be unfaithful. David had really ruffled Eddie's feathers. Whenever Eddie and I met, we dissected David's actions and speculated about his intentions and associations. Eddie confided in me that he had enlisted Nancy Wall, old Jacob's secretary, to keep a discreet watch and report anything suspicious. He even explained to Nancy why he was so interested in the workplace dynamics. Fortunately, Nancy had no fondness for David Phillips and was more than willing to assist. So far, Nancy hadn't reported anything out of the ordinary. This lack of intel only fueled my anxiety. The idea that David could suddenly turn over a new leaf just didn't sit right with me. I shadowed Janet closely and showered her with attention, which she seemed to appreciate, rewarding me multiple times in the evenings. The family had organized a grand celebration for Sally and Jacob's 50th wedding anniversary. It was to be a full gathering with all the kids, grandkids, cousins, nieces, nephews, and other family members. Skipping a family party in an Irish family required a doctor's note. Janet and Peg had been handling most of the arrangements, with some help from Chris and his wife, Bridget. Chris had met Bridget during a summer when she was temping at the firm. No one ever questioned Bridget's standing within the family, unlike the scrutiny Eddie and I faced when we first started courting Chris's sisters. The fact that Bridget's last name was Russell seemed to carry more weight in the Nelson family than Eddie's surname Powell. I never quite understood the reasoning behind it. The party was scheduled for Friday, July 15th, the exact date of Jacob and Sally's golden anniversary. I noticed Janet's increasing tension as the party approached. She spent a lot of time at her parents' house and on the phone, meticulously ensuring that everything was in order, a trait that made her an excellent lawyer, carrying her thoroughness into everyday life to ward off any surprises. It was noon on the Friday of the party when I received a call from Eddie. Jerry, Nancy just called. She overheard David on the phone, arranging to meet someone at the Tuck-In Inn at 3 p.m. today. Eddie disclosed. I'm not sure where Peg is, and if I call her cell, she'll just tell me she's anywhere. Do you know where Janet is? She mentioned having some last-minute errands, like picking up the flowers, and all that. I'll inform the guys I'm leaving early and head over to the motel before 3. I'll keep you posted, I assured Eddie. Bullshit, Eddie retorted. I'll be at the corner coffee shop near my office. Grab me on your way. The problem was, it wasn't on my way. It was already past 2, and picking up Eddie would eat into precious time. Still, he had been keeping me informed. All right, Eddie, just make sure you're ready to jump in when I pull up. We can't afford any delays, I replied, hanging up and hurrying to my truck. I arrived at the coffee shop at 10 to 3 and picked Eddie up. I acknowledged him with a nod and quickly merged back into traffic. It was going to be tight. I parked in a convenience store lot adjacent to the motel at 1:03, positioning us with a clear view of the rooms. It was an older place with about 20 units, all facing the lot in front. I turned off the engine. "There he is," Eddie exclaimed. "The bastard looks pretty cheerful, doesn't he?" David was whistling as he approached a room. He swiped the key, went inside, and closed the door. Eddie turned to me, silently asking what we should do next. I pondered the situation. Should we confront the bastard? What if he was with a woman not related to us? What if she hadn't arrived yet? We hadn't fully thought this through. "I don't want to do anything rash and land in jail, Eddie," I reasoned. "Let's wait and see who else shows up. Chances are, if any damage has been done, it's already too late." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Eddie concurred. "This probably isn't David's first rendezvous. Man, I hope it isn't one of our wives." We sat there for what felt like 15 minutes, waiting for something to happen. Finally, David emerged, closed the door behind him, and walked back to his car. As he sped away, Eddie and I continued our vigil. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and a woman stepped out. "Son of a bitch," Eddie blurted out as we both watched Janet quickly make her way around the side of the building. My heart pounded so intensely, it was almost deafening. We both knew my life was falling apart. "Jerry, let Peg talk to Janet, okay?" Eddie urged. "She can't really like that jerk. It was just a horrible mistake. I bet she already regrets it. She damn well will soon enough." I growled, firing up the engine and leaving the parking lot. Eddie was still trying to soothe me when we pulled up in front of his office. "If the roles were reversed, Eddie, what would you do?" I demanded as he got out of the truck. "I'd do something impulsive and regret it later." "I know that," Eddie admitted. "But you're smarter than that, Jerry. Think about the kids, if not yourself." "Why the hell didn't Janet think of the kids?" I shot back. "I'll handle this my way. I wasn't Irish, but cold beer always helped me relax and think things through." I pulled into a local bar and downed a couple of beers. No brilliant solutions came to mind. I realized I wasn't the clever type. I just put my head down and charged forward. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it was my way. The full significance of Janet in my life started to hit me. She was more than just someone I slept with, though she was great at that. She was my friend, my reason for living. Suddenly, I felt utterly alone and adrift, my heart aching like never before. My cell phone rang. It was Janet. "Jerry, where are you? You're supposed to be at Mom's by now. It's after 5 and everyone's wondering where you are," she snapped. I thought about telling her to go to hell, but decided against it. What better time to confront her and let her whole family know what kind of person she really was? That would give her father, Jacob, something to chew on. It was too late to change out of my work clothes, but I didn't care. If the Nelsons were so offended by a working man, I might as well piss off the whole damn family. Within 10 minutes, I found myself in the backyard of Janet's parents' estate, my jaw clenched and my temper nearing its boiling point. David's Mercedes parked at the curb had set me off. This party was about to get interesting. "Jerry, let's have a drink." My treat, Eddie called out before I could find Janet or David. It was clear he wanted to intercept me, trying to pacify my rising anger, but I wasn't having any of it. Ignoring him, I continued around the corner of the house. That's when I bumped into Sally. "Jerry, I'm so glad you're here," she said with a radiant smile. "The party wouldn't have been the same without you." She wrapped her arms around me, and I leaned down to kiss her. Sally was one person I never wanted to hurt, but the storm brewing within me was about to unleash, and when it did, there would be collateral damage. Over Sally's head, I spotted David at the bar, animatedly waving his drink and spouting some ridiculous story. I stepped around Sally and headed straight for him. David noticed my approach and must have read my intentions in my eyes. He set his drink on the counter and faced me as I closed the distance. "I warned you. "You miserable prick," I hissed. "Now it's time to pay the piper." Out of nowhere, his right fist crashed into my chin. My head snapped back, and I felt a disturbing crunch in my neck. Shaking it off, I smiled darkly at David. "So, Janet told you everything," David snarled. I knew the bitch couldn't keep her mouth shut. In the next moment, his right hand connected with the left side of my face, the impact reverberating in the otherwise silent yard. I wasn't particularly beloved by the Nelson family, but Janet was. David had just insulted her at her own family's event. Rubbing my cheek, it dawned on me that David clearly underestimated the honor code in real Irish families. I grabbed him by the lapels and slammed him against the nearby tool shed with such force that I wondered if the structure might collapse. Propping him up with my left hand, I pulled back my right fist, ready to end this. "Jerry." It was Janet. She hadn't exactly yelled. It was more the serious tone she reserved for grave offenses. Instinctively, I halted, my fist hovering, ready to obliterate David Phillips's smug face. "Janet, I'll deal with you later," I rasped. "Right now, I'm kinda busy." Suddenly, Janet stepped in front of me, pressing her hand against the arm still propping up David. "Deal with me later," she repeated, her voice full of incredulity. "I don't know what you think you're saying, Jerry, but you'll deal with me right now." "This prick just admitted everything, Janet. Not that it mattered," I added. "I saw you leave that goddamn motel today." Janet flinched as if struck. She raised her chin, meeting my gaze head-on. "If you believe I would ever betray you for this piece of shit or anyone, then go ahead and beat me. I deserve it if I did what you claim. Slap me around, tough guy." I had never seen her so emotional. Her lip quivered, her voice wavered. She knew she could cut my heart out, and I wouldn't lift a hand against her. Yet, a nagging doubt began to creep in. "If you trust me, if you love me the way I think you do, you'll let him go and let me explain. If I mean so little to you that you throw me away over something you think might have happened, then go ahead and clobber him. Smack me around too, because any woman who would cheat on a husband as loyal and devoted as you are deserves no better," she concluded. Now I was really between a rock and a hard place. David was starting to recover and squirm. If I was going to deck him, I needed to do it now. But what if Janet hadn't cheated? What if there was another explanation for her being at that motel? I looked at Janet and realized I had no choice. I couldn't give up on her. I couldn't refuse her anything. She still stirred feelings in me, even after all these years. I released David. My head snapped back as he swung a haymaker over Janet's shoulder, connecting with my left eye. It made my knees turn rubbery. I heard Janet curse, followed by the unmistakable sound of fists on flesh. I'd been around enough fights to know what that noise meant. Janet's arms wrapped around me, helping me stay upright as I staggered back. Shaking my head to clear it, I realized my vision in my left eye was blurry. But I didn't need perfect sight to see that Chris Nelson was beating the living daylights out of his former best friend. Eddie and a couple of cousins rushed in, pulling Chris away from David. Chris was panting heavily, his face a deep shade of red. He rubbed his hands over his face and took a deep breath. "Get this cowardly fool out of here and do it fast. If he's still in my sight in 10 seconds, I can't be held responsible for what I might do," he shouted. Several hands grabbed David, half dragging and half carrying him out to the front. Chris put an arm over my shoulder and wrapped the other around Janet's waist, guiding us toward the kitchen. Inside, a few people were watching through the open door. "Could we have a few minutes, just Janet, Jerry, and me?" Chris requested. Everyone quickly exited, and Chris shut the door behind them. "Janet, Bridget just confessed to me about how you stepped in today, preventing her from making the huge mistake. I'm furious with her, but I respect her courage for coming clean. I can't believe I thought that bastard was my friend while he was trying to seduce my wife." "Thanks, Janet," Chris said with a choked voice, hugging his sister tightly. I was still dazed from David's blows and struggled to understand the situation. David had slept with Bridget as well. What had Janet done? Chris let go of Janet and extended his hand to me. Though confused, I accepted it, and we shook. I owe you an apology, Jerry, for not taking your perspective seriously and firing David after that card game. Eddie mentioned he saw Janet leave the motel today. You couldn't have known she went there to confront Bridget, not to get involved with that scumbag, Chris explained. Obviously, Bridget listened to her and left. I assumed Janet stayed to deal with David. Peg and I both felt David's seductive attempts, but we had already discussed his outburst the night you and Eddie left your place, Chris. We could barely hide our disdain. Then we noticed he shifted his focus to Bridget. When she left early today, I had a bad feeling and followed her, Janet revealed. Bridget was long gone when David showed up. He and I negotiated his departure. He agreed to announce tomorrow that he'd found a better position in California and would give his 2 weeks' notice. In turn, the firm wouldn't pursue any of his ethical violations, Janet admitted. I didn't realize Jerry saw me leave the motel. No wonder he was so furious at David. "Ah, hell," I exclaimed. "I messed up again, Janet. When will I learn to trust you?" "I embarrassed you in front of everyone," I fretted. "I'd hardly say that," laughed Sally, Janet's mother, as she stepped into the room, followed by Eddie, Peg, and my 2 kids. "Everyone thought you were about to kill that miserable guy. If Janet hadn't intervened, Phillips would be searching for his head right now, and the cops would be searching for you. Not that you didn't have a good reason, Jerry. If someone insulted my Janet in front of me, I'd be just as furious. I'm proud of Janet for marrying you. I'm also proud of her for stopping you from seriously hurting that idiot." Sally chuckled. "I had a feeling you'd calm down once Janet got involved. I always had the same effect on her father. You went all soft and calm when she came near." "Weren't you worried about me killing David, Mom?" asked Chris. "Son, you did what you had to, but let's be honest. You're a lawyer. Your hands aren't exactly lethal weapons. Now look at Jerry's hands, chest, and shoulders. Phillips was in real danger for a second there. You gave him a few bruises, but he'll be fine in a few days." "What about Jerry, Mom?" asked Peg. "His eye is swollen shut, and there's a nasty bruise on his cheek. Any suggestions to ease the swelling?" Only then did I realize my left eye was completely shut, and my head was throbbing. "Janet, take your husband upstairs. Get him undressed and into the jacuzzi. I'll send up an ice pack with one of the kids. Then get yourself undressed and show him how much you love him. We'll still be partying when you come back," grinned Sally. "Mom," shrieked Peg. "Is that any way to talk to your daughter, especially in front of her children?" "Peg, don't get all prim and proper with me," laughed Sally. "These kids, as well as my grown children, should know a few secrets to a lasting marriage. It definitely isn't by withholding love and affection, especially when your husband's been beaten defending the family. Go on, Janet, and take care of your man." Less than an hour later, Janet and I rejoined the party and mingled with the guests. It seemed everyone had heard about Sally's advice for a long marriage and teased us, ensuring we'd follow her advice. Personally, I think Sally stumbled upon a recipe for success.